Hello, and greetings, my fellow ghouls, goblins, and ghosts. Welcome back to the Festival of Samhain Horror podcast. If you're new here, hi, I'm your host, Purgatory, the Queen of Samhain, and this is my Catacombs of Creepiness. Here in my Catacombs of Creepiness, we talk all things horror, big or small, with both the living and the dead. Okay, let's get started. 61 days of Halloween, week 3 is officially over. Last week, we talked all things Nicolas Cage horror, but this week, we are diving into the mysterious world of the paranormal. But just like Vampire Week, we're going to be doing it a little different. And I'm not talking about going into the history of the supernatural or anything like we did with Vampire Week, when I went into the history of vampires and vampire lore. Oh no. This week, I'm going to be talking about 2 very famous cases of the supernatural. And I'm going to be telling you guys 2 spooky stories that are sure to chill you to the very core. And they made popular movies about these 2 cases, so you've probably heard of them. And if you're a horror fan, you've definitely, or more than likely, have heard of them. I'm not sure. But the first case we're going to be talking about is the Enfield poltergeist. Between the years 1977 and 1979, in a council house, or what we call apartments or flats, in Brimsdown, Enfield in London, England, there was alleged poltergeist activity that plagued a single mother and her 2 daughters. She had 4 children, but it seemed like the hauntings were only really centered around 2 of the sisters, Janet, age 11, and Margaret Hodgson, age 13. Everything started in 1977 when Peggy Hodgson, the mother, called the police to her Enfield home with claims that she witnessed furniture moving around and that 2 of her 4 children heard loud knocking sounds on the walls inside the house. Janet and Margaret, to be exact. In fact, a police constable who happened to be on the scene at the time even reported seeing a chair wobble and slide across the room, but of course was unsure of what caused the movement. I mean, if you see something like that, you don't know if your mind is playing tricks on you or if it really happened. Later on, there were claims of hearing disembodied voices and loud noises, and other claims of children levitating, other loud noises, toys being thrown around, and chairs being thrown around. The Hodgson family weren't the only ones to witness paranormal activity, though. Over the course of 18 months, more than 30 people, including neighbors, paranormal investigators, and journalists, said to have witnessed objects being thrown across the room, very heavy furniture moving around on its own, and even seeing Janet and Margaret, the 2 sisters, levitating several feet off the ground. And there are actually pictures online. If you Google Janet and Margaret Hodgson levitating, there are pictures taken where it appears that they're levitating off the ground. There were even recordings of deep voices and loud knocking captured. And when I was researching this case, I actually went on YouTube, and there was a little documentary that somebody made on the Hodgson family during these hauntings, and it had Janet speaking in a deep, guttural, old man voice, and it was weird because it just wasn't the type of voice that you would hear that would come out of a little girl. And it's crazy because you're like, how, even if it was fake, how could they fake that? But I will link the documentary in the description below on YouTube if you guys want to check it out after this. That's totally up to you, but it is creepy. Anyway, members of the Society of Psychical research, such as inventor Maurice Grosse and writer Leon Playfair, were brought into the investigation, and they in fact did believe the hauntings to be real. Some people did believe them to be genuine, and others didn't, but that's to be expected. Nevertheless, some others weren't so easily convinced. Psychologist and parapsychologist Anita Gregory and English psychology professor John Bailoff, they were not convinced that the hauntings were genuine at all. They even believed to have found quote-unquote evidence that the sisters faked the incidents to put on a show for the journalists. This popular real case would go on to be mentioned in books, TV, and radio. And like I said at the beginning of telling the story, it was even mentioned and used in 2 famous movies. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of Ghost Watch, 1992, but they did kind of like a found footage live broadcast on Halloween night with journalists and reporters on the scene of the Enfield hauntings. And The Conjuring 2 also used this story. And both, obviously embellished a little bit of it, but definitely watch those 2 movies to get a little bit more, but I'll link the documentary about the Enfield poltergeist in the description. That'll show you and tell you basically everything that happened. It's wild. Now on to the second but the last story that I'm going to tell you guys this evening. And I think I can speak for a lot of horror fans when I say we've all seen this movie, or at least most of us. At least a lot of us have heard of this movie. It's a very popular movie in horror, and that's The Exorcist. I am going to be talking about the true story of The Exorcist, or The Exorcism of Roland Doe. As I said before, we're all familiar with the 1973 classic horror film The Exorcist, especially with all of us being horror fans here. But are you familiar with the story that inspired the novel, then later on the film? This case took place in the late 1940s, but instead of it being a 12-year-old girl, like in the movie and the book, the case centered around a 13-year-old boy, and his real name wasn't Roland Doe. That was just an alias that was used. Around this time, Roland was grieving over the loss of his aunt. It was the late 1940s. Roland and his aunt were pretty close. She taught him everything that she knew about spiritualism and got him really interested in it. One of the things she taught him was how to use the Ouija board. Oddly enough, Roland's entire family stated that really strange things began happening around the house shortly after the death of the aunt and shortly after the use of the Ouija board. The strange things the family witnessed around the house included weird dripping noises and heavy scratching. Naturally, Roland's mother believed it to be tied to the spirit of their recently deceased loved one or having something to do with it. But when the family tried to contact the spirit or spirits in the house, things only got worse for the family, and worse for Roland, for that matter. The young boy began hearing footsteps in his room in the middle of the night, and he even woke up with scratch marks found on his bed the very next day. Then, as things began to get worse, the scratches went from his bed to his body. They began to appear on his body, which prompted the family to contact their local priest, who decided to who decided to observe Roland overnight. After observing Roland, this was clearly out of the minister's field, so the family ended up converting to Catholicism. Shortly after converting, the family had Roland, well, at least attempted to have him baptized, but that didn't really work out because the reason I say attempted is because each time they tried to baptize him, Roland would have very, very, very heavy fits of rage. Roland's aggression only got worse, which prompted him to become hospitalized for a short time. A psychiatrist tried to treat him, diagnose him, and reach him, but ultimately failed. You probably are asking, though, why didn't the family just move out? Well, they did, but the spirits just wouldn't leave Roland alone. Feeling at a loss, priests were called to perform an exorcism on Roland. One of the priests, Father Raymond J. Bishop, even wrote I don't know if it was a book or something about his experience with the exorcism. Priests tried everything. Just like in the 1973 film, The Exorcist, a crucifix was placed underneath Roland's pillow to protect him. But, of course, later on, after they returned to check on Roland, they found furniture flipped over and strewn around the room and Roland's bed shaking uncontrollably. Sound familiar? Multiple priests performed multiple exorcisms on the child. One was performed at a Jesuit institution, Georgetown University Hospital to be exact, and another at the Alexian Brothers Hospital in Missouri. During the exorcisms, Roland was said to have spoke Latin, spit on people, soiled himself, and even spoke in a deep, guttural voice that nobody's ever heard before. When the final exorcism was performed, priest finally said to have been successful, leaving the young boy to finally live a normal life. We don't know for sure if any of these cases are real, but we do know they are two very famous hauntings or, paranormal events that have happened in history. Well, that just about does it for this week's episode. A little bit short and sweet. Thank you all so much for listening and supporting me on here as well as other platforms. It really means the world to me. I put a lot of work and effort into my creation, so thank you so much for being a part of it and being a part of my content creation journey. If you would like to support me further, be sure to sign up for the official Purgatory Horror Patreon. It would mean a lot, and there are lots of spooky extras that aren't available anywhere else. Or if you just want to buy me a coffee or lunch, or send a little tip or something, I'll include my CashApp tag and PayPal in the description below. But as always, no pressure. It's just there if you want to do it. Be sure to follow me on Twitter at PurgatoriHorror. Be sure to follow me on Instagram at xxPurgatoriHorrorXX. I am also on Threads at PurgatoriHorror and Bluesky at PurgatoriHorror. And just come connect with me and see what other creations that I have to offer. Okay, thank you guys so much for listening. And sorry if I was a little tongue-tied or nervous during this, but I promise I'll get better. Thank you so much for listening. I love you. So long and pleasant screams.